Secret Psychological Experiments, Unethical Tests on Humans, the paper you didn't read. Imagine you walk into a building with clean white walls and a polite receptionist. You're told it's a study. Nothing dangerous. Nothing extreme. Maybe you'll answer questions, press buttons, react to images. You sign a form you barely understand. You assume the people in lab coats are there to protect you. And then you realize something too late. You were never the customer. You were the material. Not every human experiment happened in a dark basement with chains and screams. Some happened in bright rooms with clipboards. Some were funded, approved, documented and then buried. Some were disguised as healthcare. Some as education. Some as national security. And the most disturbing part is this. Many of these experiments didn't need violence to work. They only needed trust. This is Secret Psychological Experiments, Unethical Tests on Humans, a documentary-style series about what happens when science forgets morality and people become data. In part 1, we're going to begin with the experiments that reshaped modern ethics, not because they were brilliant, but because they were horrifying. Before we go into what makes an experiment unethical, to understand these cases, you need 3 core ideas. Consent. Did the person truly understand what was being done to them and agree freely? Harm. Were participants exposed to unnecessary physical or psychological damage? Deception and control. Were people manipulated, trapped, or denied the right to stop? When these principles break, experiments stop being science. They become exploitation with paperwork. And as you'll see, the most dangerous experiments often had one thing in common. They were justified as for the greater good. One the Tuskegee study, a betrayal that lasted 40 years. If you want one story that proves how far institutions can go when nobody stops them, start here. In the United States, in 1932, a study began in Macon County, Alabama. It involved hundreds of black men, many of them poor, many of them sharecroppers who were told they would receive free medical care. They were not told the truth. The study was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Participants were examined, monitored, and kept under observation for years. But the point was not to cure them. The point was to watch what happened if they were not treated. Let that sink in. These men were used as living timelines of disease so researchers could document the natural progression. They were told they had a bad blood, a vague term that could mean many things. They were given placebos, meaningless procedures, and false reassurance. Then came the moment that turns this story from unethical to monstrous. In the 1940s, penicillin became a standard and effective treatment for syphilis. At that point, the experiment should have ended immediately. Instead, the men were prevented from receiving treatment. Researchers did not simply fail to help them. They actively protected the study, even as participants suffered complications, transmitted the disease to partners, and children were born affected. And it went on for decades. 40 years. A full lifetime for many of the men involved. The reason this case matters isn't only the harm, though the harm is enormous. It matters because it shows how easily science can turn into bureaucracy. The men weren't seen as individuals with families and pain. They were seen as a data set, a long-term chart, a valuable sample. Tuskegee didn't end because researchers suddenly gained a conscience. It ended because the truth leaked and public outrage forced the system to react. And after Tuskegee, the world began to understand something uncomfortable. You can't trust ethics to exist automatically inside institutions. Ethics has to be enforced, or it evaporates. To Guatemala when public health became a cover. Now imagine a government program presented as public health research. Now imagine it involved infecting people without consent. This happened. In the 1940s, research connected to U.S. public health authorities in Guatemala involved vulnerable populations, prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and the exposure of individuals to sexually transmitted diseases. The idea was to study disease transmission and prevention. But the method crossed a line that should never be crossed. People were used without meaningful consent, and harm was inflicted under the language of medical progress. If Tuskegee was watching people suffer without treatment, this was even darker in a different way. The manipulation of exposure itself under conditions where the power imbalance made refusal almost impossible. This case matters because it reveals a pattern. When certain groups are viewed as expendable because they are poor, institutionalized, imprisoned, or politically powerless, their ethical threshold drops. Experiments that would be unthinkable on the powerful become thinkable on the invisible. And that's the warning. Not that this happened once. This logic can happen anywhere that power is unequal and accountability is weak. 3 mg, the experiment that proved obedience, is scary. Not every unethical experiment involves disease or physical harm. Some experiments scar the mind. In the early 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran a study that became one of the most famous in history. Participants were told they were part of an experiment about learning and memory. They were assigned roles, teacher and learner. The learner was taken into another room. The teacher sat in front of a machine with switches labelled with increasing levels of electric shock. The teacher was told, when the learner answers incorrectly, administer a shock. Here's the key detail. The shocks were not real, but the participant did not know that. In reality, the learner was an actor. The screams were staged. The panic was performed. But the teacher believed it was real, and the researcher, authoritative professional, kept insisting that the experiment must continue. What happens, Milgram wanted to know, when ordinary people are instructed to harm someone under authority? The results shook the world. Many participants continued, even when the learner screamed, even when the learner begged, even when the learner went silent, not because participants were inherently cruel, but because the environment was engineered. A lab setting creates legitimacy. A calm authority figure reduces doubt. Responsibility feels transferred upward. I'm just following instructions. Milgram's study revealed something terrifying. The same human brain that can feel empathy can also be overridden by authority, especially when the harm is framed as necessary. The ethical problem here is psychological trauma. Participants often showed extreme stress, sweating, shaking, nervous laughter, breakdowns. Many left believing they were capable of severe harm. Even if they were later debriefed, the emotional damage was real. Milgram didn't prove that people are evil. He proved that systems can turn ordinary people into tools. And that's exactly why unethical experimentation is so dangerous. It doesn't require monsters. It can manufacture compliance. For the Stanford prison experiment, when an A role becomes real. A few years later, another experiment became famous and controversial. At Stanford University, a mock prison was created in a basement. Participants, healthy young men, were randomly assigned roles, guards and prisoners. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It did not. Because within days, the environment escalated. Guards began enforcing control with humiliation. Prisoners began breaking down. People stopped acting like students and started acting like stereotypes of power and submission. The line between simulation and reality collapsed. The experiment ended early due to escalating psychological harm. Why does this belong in a series about unethical tests? Because it demonstrates how quickly identity can be manipulated by structure. When you put people into a system with uniforms, titles, isolation, authority, and dehumanization, the system does not remain pretend. It becomes a psychological machine, and once it starts producing harm, the question becomes, why didn't the adults stop it sooner? That's the ethical failure. Not just that harm occurred, but that the experiment allowed it to grow because it was generating interesting results. In unethical research, harm is often treated like an acceptable cost, and that is the exact moment science becomes dangerous. 5M culture, the shadow side of national security. Now we reach the kind of story that feels like conspiracy, until you realize it has documented history. During the Cold War, governments viewed mind control, not as science fiction, as a strategic weapon. If you could influence memory, behavior, loyalty, resistance, you could potentially create the perfect interrogations, the perfect spies, the perfect control. In the United States, the CIA ran programs connected to this goal, commonly associated with the name MKUltra. Research explored methods of influencing the human mind, including the use of drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. Some participants were not fully informed about what they were being given. Some were placed into conditions that caused severe distress. The reason MKUltra occupies such a strong place in public imagination is simple. It shows how quickly ethics gets written when a nation believes it is at war, even a cold war, when the enemy is described as existential. Normal rules are treated as a luxury, and that's one of the most important themes of this entire series. Unethical experiments thrive in secrecy, and secrecy thrives in fear. Whether it's fear of disease, fear of crime, fear of war, fear of the other, fear creates permission. 6. The real horror, how easy it was. Here's the problem with viewing these experiments as isolated scandals. It makes us think they were rare. An unethical human experimentation is not a single event in history. It's a recurring pattern that appears whenever these conditions align. A powerful institution wants results. A vulnerable group has limited power to refuse. Oversight is weak, absent, or manipulated. The harm is justified as unnecessary. The horror isn't only what happened. The horror is how normal it looked while it happened. Forms were signed. Budgets were approved. Reports were typed. People went home at night and ate dinner. And the participants, the human beings, were still trapped inside the experiment. Part 1 closing, price of data. In Part 1, we saw the foundations of modern research ethics being built on tragedy. Tuskegee showed what happens when treatment is withheld for decades. Guatemala showed how public health can hide violations. Milgram showed how authority can override morality. Stanford showed how systems can manufacture cruelty. MKUltra showed how fear can justify secrecy and manipulation. But we're not done, because in Part 2, we'll go even deeper into cases where ethics collapsed completely, where the line between research and abuse became impossible to ignore, and where survivors carried consequences for the rest of their lives. And we'll ask the question that matters most. If these things happened under institutions that claimed legitimacy, what else happened that we still haven't uncovered? Part 2. The perfect subject is the one who can't say no. If you want to understand how unethical human experiments become possible, don't start with the lab. Start with the target. Because the easiest person to experiment on is not the person who agrees. It's the person who can't refuse. A child who trusts adults. A prisoner whose choices are controlled. A patient whose reality depends on a hospital. A soldier trained to obey. A marginalized community told that help is being offered. In Part 1, we saw how authority, secrecy, and institutional power could override basic human rights. In Part 2, we're going into darker territory, cases where the subjects were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable, and where psychological harm wasn't an accident. It was part of the design. One the monster study when science turned children into proof. In the 1930s, a speech study took place involving children in an orphanage. Even before you know the details, the setting tells you everything you need to know. Orphans are dependent. Orphans are supervised. Orphans don't have parents to protect them. The research question was about stuttering, whether it could be influenced by environment and feedback. But the method was ethically poisonous. Some children were spoken to with encouragement and positive reinforcement. Others were criticized, labeled, and pressures made to feel like something was wrong with them. This wasn't a study where harm happened by surprise. The harm was baked into the structure. If you want to see whether negative labeling creates speech problems, you must apply negative labeling. That's the ethical failure in its purest form, creating psychological injury to test whether injury can be created. For a child, especially one already living with insecurity, repeated negative feedback doesn't just affect speech. It can shape identity. Confidence collapses. Anxiety grows. Self-monitoring becomes obsessive. And even if a study ends, the internal voice it created may continue for years. This case is important because it shows how unethical experiments often disguise themselves as mild. No knives. No blood. No dramatic violence. Just words. And words are enough. Too little Albert, engineering fear, then walking away. Now consider one of the most famous examples in psychology, a baby known as Little Albert. The experiment was meant to demonstrate classical conditioning, how a neutral object can become associated with fear. A young child was exposed to something harmless, like a small animal. Then a loud frightening noise was introduced alongside it. Over time, the child began to fear not just the original object, but similar things, generalizing the fear to other animals and furry objects. From a purely mechanical perspective, it worked. From an ethical perspective, it's chilling, because the experiment did not just observe fear, it manufactured it. And what makes it worse is the uncertainty around whether the fear was properly reversed, whether the child's distress was ethically repaired. Imagine being able to reach into a developing mind, create a phobia, and then simply end the session. That's the cold core of unethical research. Treating a human experience there like a lab variable, and treating the subject, an infant, like a container. Little Albert matters because it exposed something we still wrestle with today. If you can condition fear and allow, you can condition fear in real life. And once you accept that fear can be engineered, you have to ask who benefits from engineering it. Pre-midnight climax when deception became a technique. There are experiments where the violation isn't only the procedure, it's the entire setup. During the Cold War era, some intelligence-linked projects explored mind influence and behavior under drugs and extreme manipulation. One of the most notorious operations involved a scenario that sounds unreal until you understand the context. Rooms were set up like normal living spaces. People were lured in under false pretenses. Drugs could be administered without meaningful informed consent. Behavior was observed secretly. It wasn't designed to treat patients. It was designed to study control, compliance, and vulnerability. This kind of experiment reveals a key pattern. When a system values information more than dignity, it begins to treat deception as efficient. And deception is not neutral. Deception removes the subject's ability to make choices. It destroys consent at the root. Once the subject is deceived, everything they do becomes contaminated, not only ethically but psychologically, because the discovery of deception creates a specific kind of trauma. You realize you are being watched. You realize your reality was curated. You realize your consent was never requested, only assumed. That realization can break trust far beyond the lab. It can change how a person sees institutions, authority, even their own judgment. And that's why this matters. Unethical experiments don't only harm bodies or minds in a moment. They poison trust in society itself. For Holmesburg Prison, when incarceration became a lab, prisons have always attracted unethical research for one reason: control. In prison, a subject can be monitored, contained, scheduled, pressured, and isolated. The environment itself becomes a tool. Throughout the 20th century, various prison-based experiments were conducted in different places, sometimes framed as voluntary participation with compensation. But the ethical question is obvious. Can consent be truly voluntary inside a system designed to remove freedom? If participation offers money, privileges, or relief, and refusal offers nothing, then choice becomes distorted. Even when an experiment is not primarily psychological, prison research often contains psychological coercion. Subjects may feel compelled to comply. They may fear consequences of refusal. They may misunderstand risks. They may accept harm as the only available way to gain something, anything, in an environment built on deprivation. And once a research culture normalizes using prisoners, it tends to expand. Bigger studies, harsher protocols, less empathy, because the subject stops being a person and becomes a category inmate. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of unethical experimentation. The world often decides certain groups are easier to sacrifice, and then builds systems where sacrificing them feels normal. 5 aversion therapy, when identity was treated as a disease. Now we enter a chapter of history that is both psychological and deeply personal. For decades, in various countries and institutions, attempts were made to change sexual orientation or gender expression using punitive conditioning methods often described as aversion-based approaches. Some people were pressured into these programs by family, law, religion, or medical authority. Some were minors. Some were institutionalized. The methods could involve humiliation, isolation, psychological manipulation, and coercive conditioning. But the deepest ethical violation is this: the premise itself, the idea that a person's identity is a defect to be corrected, and that distress is an acceptable tool for correction. Even when these programs were framed as treatment, they frequently produce shame and self-loathing, anxiety and depression, trauma symptoms, damaged relationships with family and authority, and often, the only success they could claim was compliance, a person learning to hide, to perform, to survive. If an experiment or therapy measures improvement by how well someone suppresses themselves, that is not healing, that is control. This belongs in a series about unethical human testing because it highlights a critical point. Science can be misused not only by governments or spies, but by mainstream institutions when culture labels certain people as wrong. When society calls a group deviant, unethical research doesn't look unethical to the people doing it. It looks necessary. Sixth sensory deprivation and breaking the mind by removing the world. There's a myth that torture has to be physical, but one of the most powerful ways to damage a person is to alter the environment so completely that the brain begins to collapse inward. Researchers and institutions explored sensory deprivation in different forms: removing sound, isolating sight, restricting movement, controlling temperature, minimizing human contact. The psychology is brutal in its simplicity. The brain expects input. When you remove input, the brain doesn't become calm. It becomes unstable. Time perception distorts. Anxiety increases. Attention fragments. Hallucinations can occur. Identity can feel blurry. The subject becomes easier to influence because the internal world becomes louder than the external one. And the ethical problem is not only the distress, it's the potential purpose. If sensory deprivation makes people more suggestible, then it becomes attractive to anyone seeking control. Interrogators, propagandists, abusers, authoritarian systems. This is why a psychological technique is never just a technique. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. And the scariest part is how clean it looks. No visible bruises. No blood. Just a room. Just silence. Just time. 7. The broken trusted pattern of why these cases feel connected. At this point, you might feel like these experiments are too different to belong in the same story. Orphanages. Infants. Prisons. Secret rooms. Therapies. Isolation. But there's a common thread. Unethical experiments often rely on one psychological resource: trust. Children trust adults. Patients trust doctors. Citizens trust institutions. Subjects trust that research means protection. The moment that trust is exploited, the subject becomes defenseless, not because they are weak, but because the world taught them that certain authority figures are safe. And once trust is broken at scale, entire communities carry the damage. Tuskegee didn't only harm individuals, it harmed generational trust in medical systems. Prison research doesn't only affect subjects, it affects how society justifies treating incarcerated people as less human. Coercive therapies don't only traumatize people, they teach culture that cruelty can be called a care. So when we talk about unethical experiments, we're not only talking about the past, we're talking about how the present is shaped, because the shadow of these cases still affects whether people believe in institutions today. It's the most important question of who decides what's acceptable. Every unethical experiment begins with an internal permission slip. Someone says, "It's not that bad. It's necessary." They won't understand anyway. They're already damaged. It's for national security. It's for progress. It's for science. And once that permission slip is signed, the rest becomes logistics. That's why part 2 is intentionally focused on vulnerable groups. Because the easiest way to make unethical research feel normal is to choose subjects society already treats as invisible. A child without parents. A prisoner without freedom. A patient labelled unstable. A stigmatized identity labelled wrong. The ethical line doesn't break all at once. It erodes. And erosion is hard to notice, until you look back and realize how far you've gone. Part 2, closing the lab without walls. In part 1, the horror was authority and secrecy. In part 2, the horror is vulnerability. How easily human beings can be selected, shaped, and harmed when they lack power. We've seen fear conditioned into a child. We've seen identity treated as pathology. We've seen prisons and institutions become convenient laboratories. We've seen environments used to destabilize the mind. But part 3 goes to the question that sits underneath everything. How did the world respond? Because these scandals didn't just create trauma, they created rules. Modern research ethics, consent standards, oversight boards, review processes were built on the ruins of these cases. And yet even today, ethical problems don't vanish. They evolve. In part 3, we'll cover what changed, what didn't, and the modern grey zones. Experiments run through manipulation, mass behaviour testing, misinformation, and the thin line between research and social control. Because the most dangerous experiments are not always the ones hidden in history. Sometimes they're the ones happening so quietly. They don't look like experiments at all. Part 3. The experiments that don't look like experiments. When most people imagine unethical human experiments, they picture the past. Black and white photos. Old hospitals. Basements, files, sealed archives. But the most unsettling truth is this. Unethical psychological experimentation didn't vanish. It adapted. It learned to wear clean language. It learned to hide inside user experience, inside of public safety, inside marketing, inside research partnerships, inside terms and conditions, and sometimes it learned to disappear into the background of daily life so completely that subjects don't even know they're subjects. Because in the modern era, you don't always need a lab coat or a locker room. You just need data, influence, and a system that can change human behavior at scale. Part 3 is about what happened after the scandals, how ethics was rebuilt, why it still fails, and the grey zones that remain. Not because history repeats perfectly, but because human incentives do. One after the scandals, how research ethics was born from damage. The reason modern ethics exists is not because institutions naturally became moral. It exists because harm became undeniable. When the public learned that people had been deceived, infected, manipulated, traumatized, or treated as disposable, society demanded boundaries. Out of that demand came the architecture of ethics, informed consent as standard, oversight committees and review boards, rules about vulnerable groups, requirements to minimize harm, and the idea that subjects have the right to withdraw. This shift was a turning point in psychology and medicine, but it also created a new illusion, one that is still dangerous. The illusion that paperwork equals protection, because ethics is not a form. Ethics is a practice. And forms can be designed to satisfy rules while still violating the spirit of them. If you want to understand the modern era, you need to understand the gap between legal and ethical. Something can be legal and still be exploitative. Something can be approved and still be harmful. Because approval systems are only as strong as the people enforcing them and the pressures they face. To informed consent, the most important idea and the easiest one to fake. Informed consent sounds simple. Tell people what will happen, the risks, and their rights, and let them decide freely. But in reality, consent fails in predictable ways. First, people don't read. They skim. They assume. They trust. Second, even when they read, they may not truly understand. Research language can be technical, vague, or misleading. Third, power imbalance distorts choice. If you're a patient who needs care, a student who wants approval, an employee who fears consequences, or a prisoner who wants privileges, your choice is under pressure. So the ethical question becomes, if the subject feels they can't say no, is it really consent? Modern unethical research often doesn't break the rule by ignoring consent. It breaks the rule by designing consent that doesn't protect the person. Consent becomes a shield for the institution, not a safeguard for the subject. And that's why part 3 matters. Because modern psychology rarely announces itself as we are testing on you. It often appears as we are improving the experience. Through the new lab platforms, feeds, and invisible variables. In the 20th century, unethical experiments needed controlled environments. In the 21st, control is built into systems. A platform can change what you see. A service can change what you're offered. An app can change the timing of notifications. A website can change the wording of a warning. A system can hide or highlight content, amplify or suppress it, without you noticing. That means human behavior can be influenced, not in hundreds, but in millions. And here's the core ethical issue. If a system can test what makes you more anxious, more engaged, more impulsive, more angry, more loyal, more compliant, then the line between research and manipulation becomes thin. When does measurement become experimentation? If two groups of users are shown different conditions to see which produces more clicks, more purchases, more time spent, more emotional reaction, is that a harmless test? Or is it a psychological experiment conducted at scale? The answer depends on what is being optimized and what the risks are. Because optimizing for engagement can accidentally optimize for distress. Humans are not neutral machines. Emotion drives attention. Shock drives memory. Theory drives fixation. So if a system learns that negativity holds you longer, it may feed you negativity, not because it hates you, but because it's optimized. And optimization without ethics is simply exploitation by mathematics. For the modern ethical trap, it's just an algorithm. One of the most powerful excuses in the modern world is, it wasn't a person, it was an algorithm. But algorithms are not morality free. They are instructions written by humans trained on human data, deployed by human institutions, serving human goals. So when a system pushes people towards specific feelings or actions, responsibility doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to assign. And that's exactly why unethical grey zones thrive today. Because the fusion of responsibility is a psychological phenomenon. The same 1 milligram revealed in a different form. If everyone feels like they're only doing a small part, nobody feels accountable for the whole. A researcher says, we're just analyzing patterns. An engineer says, I'm just implementing the feature. A manager says, we're just meeting targets. A policy team says, it's within regulations. And the subject, the human being, becomes a moving dot on a dashboard. That's how exploitation becomes quiet. 5 mass behavior testing when society becomes the participant. There's a concept that should make you uncomfortable. The world itself can become a lab. Not because someone is secretly injecting people, but because information environments can be tuned. A message is framed one way for one group, another way for another group. A warning is softened or intensified. A rumor is allowed to spread or quietly suppressed. A trend is boosted or buried. If you do this intentionally to measure outcomes, mood, behavior, compliance, you have entered the territory of psychological experimentation. Now, some testing is necessary. Public health campaigns need to be effective. Safety warnings need to be understood. Communication matters. But the ethical line is crossed when the subject cannot realistically opt out. The manipulation carries risk of harm, and the testing is hidden behind vague permission, because then the public becomes a participant without knowing it. And once you normalize that, you create a dangerous precedent. If it's acceptable to test on the public for good reasons, then it becomes easier to test on the public for selfish reasons. Money, control, political advantage, corporate dominance. This is why ethical boundaries must be stronger in the modern era, not weaker, because scale amplifies harm. 6th, they're a brand of coercion or wellness, self-improvement, and psych hacks. Another modern grey zone is the way psychological influence is packaged as help. Optimize your habits. Fix your mindset. Unlock your potential. Rewire your brain. Some of this is harmless motivation language. Some is evidence-based psychology translated for the public. But unethical influence can hide inside the same packaging. When a system encourages constant self-monitoring, guilt loops, fear of missing out, or dependency on the product for emotional stability, the person is no longer being helped. They are being shaped for retention. In classic unethical experiments, the subject didn't understand the true purpose. In modern systems, the user may feel like the purpose is self-improvement, while the underlying purpose is behavioral capture. And if someone becomes anxious without the app, ashamed without the program, or dependent on the system to feel normal, then the system has crossed into psychological control, whether it calls itself wellness or not. The ethical question becomes, is the tool serving the person, or is the person serving the tool? 7 vulnerable groups still exist. they just have new names. In part 2, we discussed how unethical experiments seek vulnerable populations. That didn't stop. It changed shape. Vulnerability today might mean economic pressure, unstable housing, lack of healthcare access, language barriers, immigration status, social isolation, or dependence on a platform for income. When participation in a study or in a system becomes tied to survival, consent becomes compromised. If you need the money, you accept risks. If you need the job, you agree. If you need the service, you tolerate manipulation. And the world can rationalize it easily because the participants chose it. But choice under pressure is not freedom. That's one of the simplest ethical truths, and one of the most ignored. It's what ethical oversight can't see. Review boards and ethics committees are designed for traditional research. A defined study, a defined population, a defined risk. But modern influence systems are dynamic. They change daily. They learn. They personalize. They test quietly and constantly. Even a well-intentioned oversight process can struggle to evaluate long-term psychological effects, cumulative stress, algorithmic feedback loops, the effect of social comparison, addiction-like engagement patterns, and the mental health impact of content exposure. Some harms are not visible in a short study window. They are slow. They show up as burnout, as anxiety, as nullness, as distorted self-image, as social polarization, as chronic stress. And because these harms are distributed across millions, they can be dismissed as individual issues, when they may be system effects. That's a modern ethical crisis. The harm is not always dramatic. It's ambient. None the most important lesson from all three parts. Across Tuskegee, Milgram, prisons, orphanages, coercive therapies, and modern influence systems, there is a single repeating mechanism: dehumanization. Not always emotional cruelty, sometimes administrative. When a person becomes a subject, a user, a segment, a metric, a cohort, a conversion rate, their humanity fades from the decision-making process. And when humanity fades, ethics becomes optional. That's why ethics can't be a decorative layer. It must be built into incentives. Because if an institution is rewarded for outcomes and not punished for harm, harm will be produced. Not always intentionally, but inevitably. Then how do we protect people without stopping progress? The goal is not to fear science. Psychology has helped millions. Medicine has saved lives. Research has built tools that reduce suffering. The goal is to protect human dignity while pursuing knowledge. So what actually works? Transparent consent that is understandable, not legalistic. Real opt-out mechanisms that don't punish refusal. Special protections for vulnerable groups. Independent oversight with real power. Harm monitoring that looks at long-term effects, not only immediate outcomes. Accountability for institutions, not only individuals. Because the world doesn't need less knowledge. It needs less exploitation. Closing the line is always there. We just choose whether to cross it. Unethical experiments are not just stories about bad people in history. They are stories about what happens when results matter more than rights, and humans become means instead of ends. The past gave us warnings. It also gave us excuses. It was a different time. We didn't know better. We were scared. We were at war. We were trying to help. But now we do know better. And that means the standard is higher. Because the scariest experiments are not always the ones hidden behind locked doors. Sometimes the scariest experiments are the ones happening in the open. So normalized. So optimized. So quietly embedded into daily life that nobody calls them experiments at all. And if you remember one thing from this entire series, let it be this: ethics is not a historical achievement. It is a daily decision. Because the line between research and abuse doesn't disappear. It simply waits for someone to justify crossing it. Thanks for watching Secret Psychological Experiments, Unethical Tests on Humans. If this series made you think, like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for the next episode. And tell me in the comments, Which experiment disturbed you the most and why?